She walked into that room like she'd walked into 100 rooms before it. Steady steps, shoulders back, eyes forward. Nobody had to tell Colonel Renata Hayes how to carry herself. She'd learned that a long time ago, in rooms that didn't want her there, doing jobs people didn't think she could do. The briefing room was full that morning. Officers from 3 branches, sitting shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the joint operation review to begin. Renata had flown in the night before. No entourage, no fanfare, just her, a folder under one arm and 30 years of service behind her eyes. She didn't wear her medals that day, just her service uniform, clean and simple, insignia small against the fabric. She never needed to announce herself. Her record did that. Near the front of the room stood a Navy SEAL, young, built like he'd never lost a fight in his life. The kind of confidence that comes easy when the world has never once made you prove yourself twice. He saw her walk in, didn't recognize her, didn't bother trying. "Can I help you find a seat, sweetheart?" he said, loud enough for the row behind him to hear. A few people chuckled, nervous laughter, the kind that fills a room when nobody's sure if it's funny or not. Renata didn't answer right away. She set her folder down on the table, pulled out a chair, sat. He wasn't done. "You lost? This is the pre-brief for Combat Command. Might be the wrong room." Somebody near the back shifted in their seat. Somebody else looked down at their hands. Nobody said anything. That was the part that hurt more than the words themselves. Not the SEAL's arrogance that was almost expected. It was the silence around it. The quiet agreement that this was fine, that this was normal. That a black woman walking into a room full of rank and command could still be mistaken for someone who didn't belong. "What's your rank, sweetheart?" he said again, smirking now, playing to the room. She looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, just with the tired patience of someone who had heard some version of this question her entire career. "Colonel," she said, flat, simple, no performance in it. The smirk didn't move off his face right away. It took a second for the word to land. Colonel, not lieutenant, not captain. "Colonel," he laughed it off, quick, covering the crack in his confidence. "Sure you are." She didn't argue with him, didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. She'd spent 3 decades learning that the loudest person in the room isn't always the one who's right, and the calmest person is usually the one who's earned the right to be. Inside, though, something old stirred. A memory of her first year at the academy when an instructor told her she wasn't built for command. Like leadership was a body type instead of a discipline. A memory of the meeting where she laid out a plan flawless in its logic, only to watch a room nod along after a man repeated the same idea back 5 minutes later. A memory of standing in doorways waiting to be let in when the door should have already been open. She thought of her father, who served 2 tours and came home to a country that saluted his uniform in public and doubted his intelligence in private. She thought of her mother, who scrubbed floors in houses she'd never be invited to sit in, so her daughter could sit in rooms like this one. None of that showed on her face. She simply opened her folder, straightened the papers inside, and waited for the briefing to begin. The SEAL still smirking beside her, still certain he understood exactly who she was. He had no idea what was about to walk through that door. Her father came home from Vietnam with a chest full of ribbons and a country that couldn't be bothered to look him in the eye. He never talked much about the war. What he talked about quietly, late at night when he thought she was asleep, was the paperwork that got lost, The commendation that never came through. The white soldiers who served beside him and went home to parades, while he went home to a silence so loud it filled every room of that small house. He never called it unfair. He didn't have the luxury of that word. He just went to work every morning at a factory that didn't know his name, wore his old service jacket on Veterans Day, and stood a little straighter every time the flag went by. Renata used to watch him do that. She never understood it as a child. She understood it completely by the time she was 30. Her mother cleaned houses. Big ones with staircases and chandeliers and families who never once asked her mother's first name. She left before sunrise and came home after dark, and some nights she was so tired she fell asleep at the kitchen table before dinner was even finished. But every night, tired or not, she asked Renata the same question. What did you learn today? Not because she cared about the answer. Because she wanted her daughter to know that learning was the one thing nobody could take from her, no matter whose floors she had to scrub to pay for it. Renata carried both of them into every room she ever walked into. Her father's silence, her mother's exhaustion. She carried them up the stairs of the academy on her first day, when an instructor looked at her file, looked at her, and said, not unkindly, almost like advice, that she wasn't built for command. Like leadership was something you could see on a person's skin instead of something you proved with your mind. She didn't argue with him either. She just went back to her room that night, sat on the edge of her bed, and cried, quiet enough that her roommate wouldn't hear. Then she got up the next morning and outscored every cadet in her class on the tactical exam. It didn't stop there. It never stopped. Every new post, every new command, there was always someone who needed convincing. A commanding officer who assigned her the smallest team first, just to see if she could handle it, when the men beside her were handed full command without a second thought. A room full of colleagues who talked over her in briefings until the numbers came in and her plan was the one that worked. She got used to being doubted before she ever opened her mouth. She got used to being the only one, the only woman, the only black officer, the only person in the room who had to prove twice what everyone else only had to prove once. Nobody ever told her that was the price of being first. She learned that on her own, in empty barracks and quiet drives home, in the space between who she was and who people assumed she must be. She learned something else too, though. She learned that a mistake would never be read as just a mistake. It would be read as evidence. Evidence that the doubters had been right all along. So she stopped making mistakes. She studied longer, planned harder, double-checked what everyone else only checked once, not because she wanted to be perfect, but because she couldn't afford not to be. It cost her things. Friendships that never quite formed because she always held a little of herself back. Years she spent alone at her kitchen table, the way her mother once had, running numbers and drills long after everyone else had gone home to their families. A kind of loneliness that came from being strong in rooms that never once asked if she was tired. But none of it broke her. Somewhere between her father's silence and her mother's question, somewhere between the cadet who was told she wasn't built for this and the officer who proved otherwise 100 times over, Renata had stopped waiting for anyone's permission to know her own worth. She sat in that briefing room now, folder open, papers straight, the seal still smirking beside her, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not anger, something steadier than anger. She didn't need him to see her. She never had. She only needed to keep being exactly who she'd always been. She sat up a little straighter and waited for the door to open. The doors at the back of the room opened, and the sound of boots on tile cut through every conversation at once. 4 generals walked in together, unhurried, the kind of men whose presence alone could still a room without a word being spoken. Every officer stood. Chairs scraped back, spines straightened on instinct, the way they're trained to. The SEAL rose with the rest of them, still half smiling, still certain the morning was going exactly the way he expected it to. Then the first general's eyes found Renata. He didn't hesitate. He raised his hand in a full, sharp salute and held it. The second general followed a half-second behind him, then the third, then the fourth, until all 4 of the highest-ranking men in that building were standing at attention, saluting a woman who hadn't said a single word since she sat down. The room didn't just go quiet. It went still. Renata rose from her chair unhurried and returned the salute with the same steady calm she'd carried since she walked through the door that morning. No smile of satisfaction, no glance toward the SEAL to see if he understood yet. She didn't need to look. She could feel it, the way the air around him had changed. His face had gone pale, his jaw had gone slack. Somewhere in the last 4 seconds, 30 years of her record had caught up to him all at once, and he had nowhere to put it. The woman he'd called sweetheart. The woman he'd told to find a different room. She was the reason 4 generals had walked in and saluted first, before a single briefing slide had even gone up on the screen. One of the generals spoke, his voice carrying easily across the silence. Colonel Hayes ran 3 of the most difficult joint operations of the last decade. Half the men in this room owe their lives to decisions she made under fire, decisions nobody else was willing to make. He paused. Let that settle. We're here because she asked us to be. Wouldn't miss it. Renata gave a small nod, thanking him, and turned back to the room. She didn't look for the SEAL specifically. She didn't need to make an example of him in front of everyone. That wasn't who she was, and it never had been. But when her eyes did pass over him, just briefly, she saw exactly what she expected to see. A man realizing, maybe for the first time in his career, that the uniform in front of him didn't care what he assumed walking in. She spoke to the room, calm and even, the same voice she'd used all morning. Let's get started, she said. We have a lot to cover. That was it. No lecture. No demand for an apology. She didn't need one, and making him give one in front of everyone would have made the moment about her anger instead of his ignorance. She'd learned a long time ago that dignity doesn't need an audience to prove its point. It just needs to keep standing where it's always stood. Later, after the briefing ended and the room emptied out, the SEAL found her near the door. He didn't smirk this time. He looked, for the first time that day, like a much younger man than he'd been that morning. Colonel, he said, I owe you an apology. I made an assumption I had no right to make. She studied him for a moment, not coldly, just honestly. You did, she said. Next time, ask before you assume. It costs you nothing, and it might save you from looking foolish in front of 4 generals. There was no bite in it. Just truth, delivered the way she delivered everything, plainly and without apology of her own. He nodded, and for once had nothing clever to say back. She walked out of that building the same way she'd walked in, Steady steps, shoulders back, eyes forward. She carried her father's silence with her, and her mother's tired question, and every doubting officer who'd ever underestimated her before watching her prove them wrong. She didn't need the SEAL's approval. She never had. She only needed him, and everyone like him, to understand one simple truth. Respect was never his to withhold in the first place. It was hers, earned a long time ago, in rooms far harder than this one. My name is Simmons, and this has been another story from Chronicles of Black. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what stood out to you most. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting to be told. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.